This is so cool to be here in the oldest medical school, and I'm coming from the oldest university in coming from University of Virginia. So it's kind of cool. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for staying behind. I know those were very intense 2 days that we had together, and I mean, thank you, Nick, and all the team at the University of Maryland, because that was fantastic, the way you handled us and all the technology problems. And we had remarkable speakers, and I mean, really, this was a really nice MatSci 2022, finally in person. So, so thank you for staying behind and help me welcome Dr. John Lorsch as our closing keynote speaker. John is the director, Dr. John Lorsch is the director of the NIGMS, the National Institute of General Sciences at the NIH. John received his BA from Swarthmore College. I used to be in Delaware, so up there, and his PhD in biochemistry from Harvard, and he did a postdoc at Stanford. So he has quite a pedigree. And before he came to NIH, he actually was at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the Department of Biophysical Chemistry, where he had a very successful scientific career, of course, but he also spearheaded the development of the Center of Innovation in Graduate Biomedical Education. And education is at the center of what we do in the course. So I thought I should mention that. When Dr. Francis Collins, so I found out because I was Googling, when Dr. Francis Collins announced in 2013 the selection of Dr. John Lorsch as the new director of the NIGMS, he said, and I quote, "No pressure." "With his reputation of being a broad-minded and visionary thinker with strong management skills, I am confident John will lead NIH basic science flagship, the NIGMS, to keep the US at the forefront of biomedical research." No pressure at all. And really, mission accomplished, I think. Fast forward 9 years, and John is now at the helm of a almost $3 billion operation, enterprise that funds 10% of NIH grants, more. So more than 10%, he's going to tell us maybe 15, 20. And he supports training and educational awards, and administer programs that support access to research resources, which we like to hear, and technologies. And also dear to my heart, when I used to live in Delaware, which is one of the Institutional Development Awards state, he built biomedical capacity in under-resourced institutions, like minority institution, as well as underfunded states. Delaware was one of them through the IDEA program, and supported the COBRIs and IMBREs, which are Center of Biomedical Research Excellence, and provided, I can tell you, large support to our infrastructure, including the core facilities. And it helped us, achieve more than we could do without this program. So I met John through the IDEA program. So I met him at conferences, and maybe the last one we were reminiscing may have been the one in Washington, DC, 4 years ago. And from the day I met him with my colleague, whom from Vermont, Tim Hunter, we immediately recognized the immense talent of this man, but also how he understood and he got the core culture, and he understood what we were about. And he's here today because he consistently support cores and try to enhance our, the idea of the partnership between the research and the cores. We're not just technical point of service, we are also scientific partners. We can be scientific partners. And John is someone that is going to be our champion. And so we need that at the NIH. Thank you so much for coming today. And without further ado.
Thank you very much, Katja. Thanks for staying around for this last talk, I think. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we view core facilities' role in some important issues related to biomedical research, particularly rigorous, reproducible, and safe research. And so I think, oops, here's the keyboard. Got it. So some years ago, at this point, it was probably close to a decade ago, there was a growing recognition that rigor and reproducibility in biomedical research was sort of under threat and being challenged. And this was noted by the research community and by the general public at large in a number of publications. And it was pointed out that this was a problem across all research areas, and especially a problem in preclinical research. And this got the attention of everybody from scientists themselves to Congress to the general public, was the subject of articles in magazines, newspapers, journals. These are just a few of the many articles that came out related to this so-called reproducibility crisis. It even made it onto the late night talk shows. John Oliver had a whole segment on it. And actually, if you want a good crash course into the problem, his segment was surprisingly accurate and surprisingly good. Also kind of funny, but so this was something that wasn't just noticed by scientists themselves or people who were related to biomedical research. It was noted, again, the halls of Congress, the general public, the media, et cetera. And therefore, at the very least, it was a public relations crisis. But in reality, I think it was more than that. It was a crisis in how we are using taxpayer money and how we are advancing the mission of trying to improve human health. So we spent a long time studying this problem and analyzing it and discussing it with professional societies and experts and others. And I think one can boil down the problem into three areas that are interrelated with one another. One is the sociology of science, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. One is the methodologies used, and then one is training and education. And I think we recognized pretty early on that that last one, training and education, really strongly impacts and affects the other two, sociology and methodology. And therefore, at NIGMS, when Francis Collins asked every institute and center at NIH to do something to try to ameliorate this so-called reproducibility crisis, we decided to focus much of our attention on training and education. And that's in part because NIGMS has the largest footprint in training and education at NIH, but again, also because we thought that this was in some ways the root of the problem. So we have done a number of different things at NIGMS to try to advance the rigorous and reproducible nature of biomedical research using that handle of training and education. Some examples are, we had a funding opportunity announcement, actually a couple, to support the development of training modules, so shareable online free modules that would enhance data reproducibility and good experimental practice. And these were made by people all over the country who had expertise in various areas. There are a number in things like statistics. There's some that are about experimental design. There's some that are about other aspects related to rigor and reproducibility. We've put all of the products of those grants, those training modules, on a clearinghouse on our website. And the web, you can have these slides, and the website is shown there, where anyone can come use them. So it could be you want to use them for a course. It could be you want to use them in your core facility so that anyone who comes and use your core facility has to review them first, or an individual who just wants to improve their skills can take these and use them. We also gave administrative supplements and are actually continuing to give administrative supplements to our training grants, our T32s and our undergraduate T34 training grants, to allow people who run the training grants to innovate and develop new ways to improve the rigor and reproducibility of research through what they're teaching graduate students, whether it be in the classrooms or in the core facilities or in the labs. And so a focus there we had was on skill development and improving skills, whether those be quantitative skills, whether they be actual physical skills, whether they be skills in how you design an experiment. One thing we found when we were doing research on the subject is we put in a request for information out to the community and asked them what they were teaching in graduate programs in terms of experimental design. And actually what we got back was pretty shocking, which was that it was clear from the responses that most people didn't even understand the question. They didn't even understand what we meant by experimental design. And those who maybe kind of did just said, well, we teach some statistics in the first year. And so it was pretty clear that that was a deficit in the didactic portion of graduate programs. And so that's something we've really been trying to emphasize is focusing on, in what you're teaching in the first or second years of the graduate curriculum, skills development, particularly skills needed to design good experiments, to execute good experiments, and to analyze the data and interpret the data in as rigorous and reproducible a fashion as possible. We also gave supplements to improve lab safety culture, and I'm going to have more about this to say in a few minutes, because this has been another area which is actually, I think, related in some ways to the rigor and reproducibility problem, but it's another area that we have significant concerns about. And then we also gave administrative supplements just in general to allow programs to innovate and to modernize their training, hopefully feeding back on these general issues. And we've given supplements in these various areas for the last 5 years or so now. We put summaries of everything that's been done up on our website, so you can see what different programs and different schools have done. And the hope is that after they've finished developing these and piloting these, they will then disseminate them. And that was actually part of the deal, that we gave them the money to do this, but then they had to test it and disseminate it. This just shows that clearinghouse I mentioned to you, and some of the content that's on there. Again, there are modules related to all sorts of things, from experimental design to statistics, either generally or in specific areas like related to animal studies. I know that you've had a lot of focus in this meeting on animal work, and that's a particular area. This Dr. Carroll, I think, Erin Carroll's modules are really quite excellent if you want to go look at those, very professionally done. And iBiology had an entire series of modules that they produced related to how to design rigorous and reproducible experiments. So lots of content on there. I hope you'll look at it and explore it and see how you can incorporate it into what you're doing, either in your facilities or bring it back to your institution for use. Then another issue that we identified and then therefore decided to put some effort into trying to improve was issues related to methodology. And these, of course, are near and dear to your hearts. And these could be, you know, whether someone actually knows how to use the instrument they're using in the right way to make good, reproducible, rigorous experiments. It could be whether they know that the reagents they're using are actually what they think they are from one moment to the next. And so we looked at what we at NIGMS could do in particular in this space, and we identified one problem that had been pressing for actually decades. And when we started to tackle this in maybe around 2014 or so, still had been largely unaddressed. And that's the problem of reproducibility in cell culture studies, in particular, the issue of misidentification of cell lines. So when we looked at this at the time, there were over 400 cell lines that had been shown to not be what they were reported to be. That is, they've been misidentified. And those cell lines dated back to the 1960s, but often, you know, had been derived much more recently. And if you think about this, this is a very, very serious problem, right? So if you think you're working on a pancreatic cancer cell line and it turns out to be HeLa cells, much of what you're learning about pancreatic cancer has nothing to do with pancreatic cancer, right? And so that literally is what was going on. It was actually even worse than that because not only was the cell line often not from the tissue it was said to be from, it was more than occasionally not even from the species it was said to be from. So there were cell lines that were thought, said to be human that were actually mouse or something like that, or vice versa. So that's, you can appreciate another significant problem. So in 2004, there was a survey done of researchers, and 70% of those who responded said they had never checked the identity of their cell lines, despite this known and well discussed problem. So, if you think about combining those two things together, it indicates that probably a fair amount of people, at least in 2004, were doing experiments on cell lines that were not what they thought they were. Major repositories, when they were surveyed, which actually did check their cell lines, would report that somewhere between 14 and 30% of the cell lines that people submitted to them were either misidentified or contaminated with a different cell type, right? So, and that again gives you a sense of the magnitude of this problem. These are cell lines that people feel confident enough about to submit to a repository, and somewhere between 15 and 30% of them aren't what they said, or at the very least contaminated. And then later in 2013, a survey said that somewhere around 50% or less of cell lines had an unambiguous identifier in source and publications. So this is an issue of transparency now, of whether or not people, when they publish papers saying they were working with certain cell line, say anything in the paper about how they knew that cell line was what they said it was, right? So, you put all this together and clearly it's a pretty significant problem, but it's one that's addressable because there are standards for cell line authentication and there are affordable methods for how to authenticate cell lines, at least for humans, and now growingly for other species as well. So it's a problem that could be solved, but the community is not solving it. And I will say this is an area where core facilities are, when this issue, we really brought to the forefront, it was core facilities that really started to jump in and say, we can help you solve this problem because we know how to authenticate cell lines and we can help you do it. And, it's not that hard. But people have to want to do it, right? You can't go around walking the halls of your institution asking people to give you their cell line so you can authenticate it. They've got to come and do it. Increasingly, and I'll talk about that in a second, increasingly they do, but not all, right? And those that do, it has really been since we started this effort that they've started to require it, yeah. So, here are some of the variables. There's cell line contamination and misidentification. That's what I was just talking about. But it actually goes beyond that. There's genomic instability. So you could have the cell line you think you have, but as it grows in culture, it changes over time. And that really is a very serious issue. And therefore, one needs to be thinking about how you're treating the cells and how you're making sure what you started out studying really is the same as what you're studying a year later, et cetera. NCBI got rid of this, but they used to have this database that showed karyotypes from different cell lines. This is HeLa here. And what you'll notice is, I think there's only a couple of chromosomes, maybe 3 chromosomes that aren't somehow either rearranged or aneuploid. And if you look very closely, there's a number over each one. So when they did this, they looked at multiple different cells. The number over each one is how many times in that growth of cells they saw that particular karyotype or that particular rearrangement. And it's not always, I think the number was 3. It's not always 3. So that means even within a culture of cells, you have different kinds of rearrangements that have taken place and different kinds of aneuploid situations going on. Then there's issues like infections. The cells can be infected with mycoplasma, with viruses, for example, and that can change. how they behave. So that's a significant issue as well. And then there's other extrinsic factors, growth conditions, fetal bovine serum. That's one that we've worried about a lot because as we talk to the community about these issues, what we hear it over and over again is, well, that's a big problem. That's a big variable in my experiments. And we don't always get the result we want if we don't use the right batch of fetal bovine serum. So what we do is we find the batch that works, quote unquote works, and then we buy all of it, or as much as we can, and do all of our experiments with that. Now, if you think about that, there's a lot of different inherent problems in those statements, right? You know, you get different results depending on fetal bovine serum. This means it's not a generalizable result. And then you buy all of the available serum to do your experiments, which means no one's ever going to reproduce your experiments. So, and other problems. Oxygen concentration is another one we heard about a lot. It's a significant issue. And then the substrate on which the cells are growing is another significant issue. And these are just for cell lines. I know you've been talking about animals. I'm not going to go into this, but I'm sure you know the extrinsic factors involved in animal studies are truly alarming. I mean, down to the differences in the person who comes in and takes care of the animals, right? So one of the things we tried to do for some of these other issues was spur interest in the community, particularly in the small business community, in developing tools to help address these things. And so we put out a funding opportunity announcement, I think a couple of years in a row, trying to get companies interested in developing better tools for cell line identification, and then also developing better growth media, more reproducible growth media for cell lines. I have to say it was a little disappointing the level of interest we got in this. We only got a small number of applications and funded a handful of grants. But it is an area we are still interested in pushing forward. This is the growth media one as well. One thing we did learn in the course of this, I'll tell you, in talking to industry, you know, big industry, pharma, is that they recognize this as a huge problem. And so they spent a lot of money, each company spent a lot of internal money developing very defined and reproducible media for doing their experiments. And they have them, but they're proprietary. So this is a solved problem, at least if you have enough money to you know, do what they do, except for the fact that they're not going to give out what their proprietary secret formulas are. And even when we asked them, they wouldn't give them out. So that's something to think about. And then we also engaged closely with professional societies, particularly FASEB was a great partner in all of this. We worked with them on both animal models as well as on antibodies, which is a whole nother issue that I'm sure you're aware of, is reproducibility within the antibody system. And here's an interesting fact I learned during these discussions. If you look at an antibody to, let's just take a protein RAS, for instance, and you say, the way I'm going to deal with the problem of specificity and issues like that is I'm going to buy that from 3 different vendors, because, you know, each vendor makes their own, has their own antibody. What we learned in these discussions at FASEB is there are only a few companies in the world that actually make antibodies, and then they sell them to the secondary vendors that you buy them from. So if you buy this, an antibody that you think is a different antibody from 3 different companies, you're probably just buying the same antibody 3 different times. So I had no idea that was true until I went to this meeting. Yeah, so that's exactly right. You gotta, that's for the other companies, exactly. So you all know this clearly, but I guarantee you that most graduate students and postdocs don't know it. Right? So they think they're being rigorous. And, oh, I'll just try three different antibodies, but it's the same thing. Another issue that came up had to do, again, with this experimental design problem. Excuse me. Shai Silverberg and colleagues at NIGMS did a study of preclinical neuroscience and neurology papers and looked to see whether each one did different things that they considered good experimental design practice, for instance, randomization or blinding in their assessment of outcomes, or sample size calculations. And you can see the numbers here. The number of publications is on the left that they looked at, and then the number that had each of these things is on the right. You know, it's pretty alarming, right? If you're doing a study with mice to test, say, the efficacy of an experimental therapeutic to Parkinson's disease, and you didn't randomize, you didn't blind, and you didn't even do a sample size calculation, what's going to come out the other end? So that was sobering when it came out in 2007. So based on all of this, NIH, in addition to things that I described to you that NIGMS did, NIH as a whole did a lot of things. And one of them was to clarify these issues in both what was expected in grant applications and then what reviewers looked at in grant applications. So there were 4 things that they focused on. One they originally called scientific premise. I think that was actually a pretty bad phrase, and we've since changed it. But the idea there was, what is the foundational research that leads to the work you're proposing, whether it's a hypothesis-driven study or question-driven study or something else, right? So is there a strong foundation that suggests that what you're doing is pointing you in the right direction, or are you building it on a house of cards? Bad work as the foundation is going to lead probably to bad outcomes. Then there was a scientific rigor, so all those things that we've been discussing that needs to be addressed and assessed. And you would think that this would already be there, right? This is what should be in applications and what reviewers should be looking at already. But there was a need to, I think, focus people on it. An issue that came up very frequently was thinking about biological variables, particularly sex and age. Going back to the animal issues, if you only look at your phenomenon in male mice, it's perhaps not going to be generalizable to other sexes of the species, right? And that turns out to be frequently true. And so that's something that NIH has put a lot of emphasis on. Now that of course brings up questions of, is it going to double our costs? Are we going to have to have twice as many animals, et cetera? And so those are again areas where I think core facility directors can be extremely valuable to researchers, and helping them set up their experiments in the most efficient way, in the way that gives them the most information, but reduces, keeps costs escalation to a minimum. And then one that I was very intimately involved in, this authentication of key biological and chemical resources. So now applicants have to put a small section addressing how they're going to authenticate key resources. This is not your tris and things like this. This is, if you're using a cell line and it's integral to your experiments, how are you going to know it's that cell line? In fact, when you start, in the middle of your experiments, and at the end, for example, so what are you going to do that? And then the reviewers look at that and they say, yeah, that makes sense. Or they say, that doesn't seem to make sense. And we also published a number of papers on this. The one at the bottom was one that Francis Collins and I put out about the cell line issue. And all of these are now incorporated into, as I said, the grant application instructions, and then in the review process. And then we also worked hard to raise community awareness. So you mentioned, the journals. We had a workshop in 2014 with Pharma, which is the big pharmaceutical organization. There was a workshop in 2014 with journal editors. And that actually was, I think, pretty impactful, because it led to a whole bunch of journals endorsing a set of principles, which were broadly shared, and then led to things like more and more journals requiring cell line authentication in order to publish papers. So those are just some of those journals that participated. And then here's just a couple of editorials that were written on the basis of that meeting that was held. I think one thing this did really show is how, in the face of a crisis that was growing and becoming more and more of a problem, both from public relations point of view and in terms of real scientific point of view, how different parts of the community and different stakeholders could come together and actually move things forward in very concrete and I think useful ways. Okay, and then the last piece of this I want to address was the sociology of science. And this, in a way, is the hardest piece of this whole thing. Training and education, we can do things. Methodology, you can certainly do things. Sociology is harder. And there's all kinds of issues here. The incentives perverse and otherwise being major ones. Instability of funding. If you always feel like your funding is about to get cut off if you don't get that next big paper to put into your grant, that is going to change, how you approach your science, whether you like it or not. A focus on innovation, I think, sometimes drove things improperly in the wrong direction. Novelty, right? There's this question of, can you publish something if it's not perceived as novel or if the findings are actually negative? And that's been a big problem, right? If you try to reproduce somebody's work and you find out that you just can't reproduce it, even though you think you did exactly the same thing they did, or you find out the cell line's not what they said it was, it's not that easy to publish it, right? And many people won't even go through the hassle of trying to do it. And so that leads to this publication bias, where supposedly positive results are published much more frequently than a mountain of negative results. And that gives, I think, a false impression of the strength of conclusions. What I call the one-word journals, some people have called the vanity journals, right? An overemphasis on the need to publish in certain journals that have a certain bar for novelty and, wanting this story to be completely perfect and tied up and no loose ends or anything else. That really drives science in a certain direction, and I think feeds a lot of this significance, impact factor, publisher Paris, all the same kinds of issues. I don't pretend that we have solutions to these things yet. We've done various things at the NIH to try, to push in certain directions. Whether it's helped or not yet, I think the jury will still be out, and I think there's more to do. But this is certainly an area that bears a lot more thought and a lot more work, because to me, this is the most dangerous of everything, right? Is this sociology that actually drives things not to be as rigorous as possible. Okay, now I want to transition to a different part of this talk for the last few minutes. And since we're actually live, I can do what I've always wanted to do, which is ask for a show of hands. How many of you know the name Sherry Songji? One. One person. One person thinks she knows the name Sherry Songji. Okay, that makes my point, and the rest of the talk is going to be about basically who Sherry Songji was and how we can let what happened to her never happen to anybody else. So Sherry Songji was a technician in a chemistry lab at UCLA. She had just graduated from college. She was going to go on to graduate school. She was doing synthetic organic chemistry. She was working on a synthesis that required a pyrogen, T-butyllithium. Some of you may know T-butyllithium, if it comes in contact with air, it spontaneously combust. She hadn't received proper training in how to use T-butyllithium. She was not wearing proper safety equipment. She had no lab coat. She didn't have safety glasses. She used a 60 mil plastic syringe to take the T-butyllithium out of the container, and then was going to put it into the reaction vessel when the piston popped out and the T-butyllithium spilled on her clothes and her body. She received third-degree burns over 2/3 of her body. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks and then passed away from the burns. So an immense tragedy, right, that took place over 10 years ago. It led to criminal charges being filed against the PI and UCLA. Okay, so the death obviously is the major thing here, but I also want you to think about the fact that criminal felony charges were filed against the PI and the institution. They were eventually settled at the cost of millions of dollars to UCLA. And part of the settlement was that UCLA would set up a center for laboratory safety on behalf of the entire University of California systems. And so they now have that. If you're not aware of it, you should definitely later on go to their website. This is the premier source of information about laboratory safety in the country, possibly the world. It really has a lot of good information, and they actually are doing research on laboratory safety. So controlled experiments to understand the significance and the scope of the problem and to find ways to mitigate it. So let me tell you about a few other incidents, because it's easy to say, well, that was a one-off, that, terrible tragedy that happened, but I haven't heard of any other serious accidents happening. So I want to tell you about a few others. So 2006, in the middle of the night, there was one of these liquid nitrogen tanks. I'm sure you all have them either in your own facilities and labs or very nearby. It was sitting in a chemistry lab and it exploded. The bottom blew off. It went through the ceiling. It blew a hole in the floor, showering the lab below in shrapnel made of the tiles, the floor tiles and the concrete that went through it. It went like a missile through the floor above, which was a mechanical room. It broke the main water line of the building, which then flooded the entire lab and the building below it, which was full of toxic chemicals. The reason this happened was because somebody had modified the two pressure release valves. They had apparently failed at some point in history. No one ever found out who did it, but one failed. And so rather than replacing the tank, they just closed it off. Then the second one failed, they closed it off. And people, and this was some years before, people kept using it enough to vent the pressure so it didn't explode. But apparently at some point, it wasn't used for a period of time. And thank God it was 2:30 or so in the morning when this explosion happened, because otherwise multiple people would have been killed. Again, this cost the institution millions of dollars in damages and fines and other things, and was a near miss. This is what you'd call a near miss, right? Where there was a terrible accident, but luckily nobody was killed just because of the time of day it happened. 2016, University of Hawaii, some of you may have read about this, in a bioenergy research lab. They were growing bacteria under atmospheres that contained hydrogen and oxygen. The day before the actual tragedy, there had been what we call a sentinel event. So in a smaller scale version of the experiment, there had been a small detonation. And then when they opened the chamber, they found it was all charred and clearly something had happened. Rather than, the postdoc did tell the PI that this had happened, but rather than saying, game over, we need to stop, they said, oh, it's okay, we'll scale it up anyways and do it the next day. So they did a scaled up version the next day. What seems to have happened is static electricity discharged into the cylinder leading to the explosion. You can see the outcome there on the lab. The postdoc lost her arm and suffered other serious injuries in this accident. Again, big investigation, major fines for the University of Hawaii. They actually contracted with the University of California Lab Safety Center, which was in full operation by this point, to come in and do a full analysis of the situation. And the UC Center said that there were deep systemic safety failures. This was not a one-off, it's just that lab's problem, but there were deep problems. And they also said, this is not just the University of Hawaii, this is throughout academia. Okay, so that's a report worth reading. I'm not sure if you can read, there were two parts of the report. One of them got taken down because of legal actions that were ongoing, but it may be back up, I'm not sure. If you can read it, it's well worth reading. Here are just a few other examples. University of Chicago researcher was working with an attenuated strain of Yersinia pestis. This, as you know, is the bacterium that causes the Black Death, bubonic plague. It was supposedly attenuated, but the researcher apparently was not using gloves routinely in working with this strain, I guess because he thought it was attenuated. He became infected. It turned out that it was attenuated in its ability to uptake iron, which is necessary for its growth. But the researcher, unbeknownst to him, had cryptic hemochromatosis. So he had higher iron levels in his blood, which compensated for the defect in the Yersinia pestis. And he unfortunately passed away. And you can imagine going to the hospital with this, like no one thinks you have bubonic plague, right? So it was quite late in the course of his admission to the hospital before it was figured out what was wrong with him. And the CDC investigated this and again pointed to inconsistent use of gloves as a likely factor. So this isn't just chemistry labs. One thing we frequently hear when I talk about this is, oh, this is a chemistry problem. That's where the dangerous stuff is done. But that's simply not true. A Yale student was working late at night by herself on a lathe in a physics lab. Her hair got caught in the lathe and she died. So this is from that report I mentioned from the University of California Center for Lab Safety. Many other institutions also tolerate poor safety cultures and practices, right? So damning. And even more recently, this was just, I think, last year. This happened in France. There were actually 2 cases, I believe, in Europe, where researchers working with prions appeared to have become infected with the prions and developed Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome and died from that. Okay, so I'm not trying to freak you out or be, morbid in this particular setting, which is probably well suited to the purpose, but I do want to make the point that it's easy to think that this will never happen here. Those were just one-offs, but they do happen with unfortunate frequency, these terrible tragedies where people die or are seriously injured or there's huge loss of property. I will just, since I have a minute, I'll just tell you one story that happened not far from here to me. Okay, so I used to work at Johns Hopkins, as Katja said, and my students were taking part in a day we used to have where local elementary school kids would come in and they'd do a big science demonstration for them in a lecture hall. And one of the things they used to do was a clock reaction, right, where it would turn different colors periodically. And they were practicing it the night before in the lab at night after, I'd left. There was a bunch of them there, but the clock reaction used hydrogen peroxide as to drive the free radicals. And they were putting the waste in a 4-liter brown bottle. And one of my graduate students, without thinking, after they were done, they were cleaning up, put the cap on the bottle. And they were all standing there, probably 6 or 7 of them. I wasn't there, but they told me the bottle exploded. I mean, just exploded. And they said it was like out of the movie Pulp Fiction when the guy shoots at the other guy and they miss every time. Nobody got hurt. One girl got a scratch on her face, but nobody was seriously injured. But there was a piece of glass this big embedded in the tile of the ceiling. That's how forceful this was, which I left there for the rest of my time at Hopkins, just as a warning to what can happen if we're not careful. So it could be. You can go look. Yeah, go up and look. It was in Wood Basic Science 625, one of those rooms. So it could still be there, although I think they've renovated. So anyways, so this is something that I'm trying to get people to take much more seriously. And I think you as core facility directors are probably well positioned again to help with this and probably appreciate this more than most people do. We've done a fair amount or tried to do a fair amount. We had again, an R25 grant program to let people do shareable training modules that we can put up on our website. I have to say the response to that has not been overwhelming in terms of interest, which is really too bad. We have a clearinghouse now on our website for links to safety training materials. So that's another place you can go. It has all kinds of different safety resources, other things that people have made, links to various resources, et cetera. One thing that we're particularly interested in seeing, and this goes back to this training piece, is for graduate programs to teach to industry standards, right? And industry standards could be in terms of how you keep a lab notebook, how you set up an experiment, how you use the equipment. But in this particular case, industry standards of safety. And I think that's like a win-win-win situation if we could get graduate programs to think about it in these terms, because first of all, if you're teaching to industry standards, you're going to have this benefit in terms of the labs are going to be safer, right? The industry standards are just much higher. Secondly, though, your students are going to be more marketable, because I hear from colleagues in industry constantly, you guys are great at making academic researchers, but when we get them, we have to retrain them to be industry researchers. And so, if you had a leg up, your program could have students who are that much more valuable and therefore that much more competitive. So something I'd like to see a lot more of going on. And then partnering with professional societies, I think, is another area that we're looking at, how to get them to help get their members to think and talk about these issues related to safety. we're using our bully pulpit. We have had blog posts on our feedback loop post. I wrote a paper with Allison Gammy and some of one of my other colleagues about the safety issue, where we went through some of those case studies and then talked about what we are doing and what the rest of the community can do. That's in Molecular Biology of the Cell. They very kindly agreed to make it open access and free, so you can go look at that. This is just a figure from there that talks about different things that one can do. This is a hazard assessment, so as part of teaching students how to develop good experiments, one thing that should be incorporated into that is doing a hazard assessment, thinking about what in your experimental protocol could go wrong, and what are you going to do to mitigate it from going wrong? And then if it does go wrong, despite all your efforts, what are you going to do about it, right? So that's not something I think is taught in graduate programs anywhere, as far as I know, but it really should be. And then another aspect is teaching students and faculty and others to question their assumptions. So one of the things I learned in the course of doing research in all of this and to write that paper had to do with lab coats of all boring things, right? So this is actually at UCLA, where one of the things they did was to replace all the lab coats at the institution with these blue lab coats. So the question is, was this a color thing? They didn't want white ones anymore. They wanted blue ones. Well, it turns out, and this is what I learned, the white lab coats that are ubiquitous in every lab are usually not fire resistant. In fact, they're flammable, and they're usually not solvent resistant, right? So what good are they? Not a whole lot. So these blue lab coats, which are a little bit more expensive, are fire resistant, they're solvent resistant, and they have elasticized cuffs. I more than once in my career have seen somebody knock over a Bunsen burner with the cuffs of their lab coat and catch fire. So it's a little thing, but I bet no graduate students thinking that the lab coat you're giving them in the lab is dangerous, but in fact they are, right? So let's question our assumptions. And this again, just from our paper, it shows what institutions can do and what NIGMS is doing and how those two things can synergize with each other. So the question then is, to you, what else can we do? I think the thing that's been hardest for me in all of this, in addition to just hearing the terrible stories and thinking about the loss of life and health, is that it's been really hard to get academics interested in this. I think they think this is, John's just on his bully pulpit about something that's never going to happen. This is the problem of our lab safety people who come into our lab and bother us every couple months, right? And we put all the razor blades in a drawer when they come in, and then we take them out when they leave. So it is a much bigger problem than that. And I really wish we could get people more interested in it. So just to summarize, how can you as core facility leaders help improve rigor and reproducibility and safety in biomedical research? Well, I have a few ideas I'll put out to you. One is, I've thought for a long time, actually since I was at Hopkins, that it would be really useful to get core facilities more integrated into the teaching missions of their institutions in addition to the research missions. You have a huge amount to offer in terms of hands-on research education, right? And just think about yourself. Would you learn more if you were actually using an instrument and seeing the data that comes off the instrument and then analyzing those data, or sitting in a classroom hearing some boring professor like me tell you the theory behind it, right? The answers, the answer. So I think as we push graduate programs to move to more active methods of teaching in the first year or two of their graduate curricula, is really an opportunity for core facility directors and core facilities to become more engaged in that. You then have the ability to teach the students to do it the right way from the start, right? That's going to improve the rigor and reproducibility of research, which is for the good of everything. It's going to make those students better scientists, which is for the good of the PIs as well, and then is going to make them more marketable. So again, it's a win-win-win situation all around. If they learn to do things the right way, if they know what the core facilities have to offer and what can be done with them, science is going to be better and faster. And I think there's another win here, which is it provides a second mission for the core facilities. And every time I talk to the research deans at the AAMC, for example, you guys are number one on their list of things they want to talk to. How do we support our core facilities? Well, I know it's a challenge, but you, I think, will agree, you got to do it one way or another because they're so important. But if they also were integrated into the teaching mission, that now gives them another stake and potentially another source of income, right? And makes those schools better, which is the goal of the school. I think core facilities can help work to develop, distribute, and use standard operating procedures and make that something that everyone at the institution is thinking about. And those would include the safety assessments as part of what they're doing. You could provide training and rigorous data analysis, right? Not just how do you do the experiments and here, here's the data, but how do you do it? How do you analyze the data? And then, as I told you, NIH has put a lot of new emphasis in the grant applications on rigor and reproducibility. And in our training grants, we have an emphasis on safety now as well. And so that's another place that I think the core facilities could really provide additional value with helping PIs add those elements to their grants. And that would, again, show value to the institutions in greater success rates of grants, et cetera. You know how it works. So that's what I had to say. Yes, ma'am. Right. Absolutely, absolutely. Yep. Yep. And certainly, I think we tried to make very clear that budgeting for things like that was certainly a reasonable thing. I mean, the nuances, right? If they're modular, there's no detailed budget, so they use it for whatever they want. So when they say I don't have the money for it, well, but if they're above that cap, then they can put in a line and say, we need this much for those services. Now, my recollection when we looked at the numbers is it's not that expensive. So when I hear those things, I'm like, well, you can buy the pre-poured gels instead of pouring the gels yourself, but you can't authenticate your cell lines a couple times. I mean, there you go. Right. Well, that's an issue, and that's something that there was work going on when we started this. I haven't looked recently at the state of it, but there was interest in developing more markers and standards for mouse cell lines and for other cell lines. But I think we need to look into it more and see how advanced it is. Yeah. I don't remember, we had discussions with NIST, and this is an issue that came up, and it's ringing a bell, but I can't remember how much they had done on it. But it's an issue. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
you know, schedule.
Yeah. I can't point to a specific example. We're certainly pushing for it. Sometimes it takes a while for the study sections to engage. But my hope is that you will see those kinds of things coming in. Absolutely, right. Yeah. And it'll probably start with a program that's doing a particular lot in that space, that the study section will say, this was a thing we really liked. But eventually it may get to the point that it's an expectation, and when they don't see it, they'll say, it would be better if you had done that. Correct, exactly. Yeah, so that takes some time because the study section has to kind of acclimate itself to what its expectations are by seeing the good ones. Yeah, I think, so this is a little bit aside from my area of expertise, so I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think the first thing that we wanted was for people to really think about this, both the researchers and the study sections. So it sounds like that's starting to happen, which is really good, right? Then from there, hopefully it will impact the science, and it won't just be like, yeah, we gave lip service to it. And so, similar to the previous question, I think it takes some time to ramp up expectations. Someone just says, I'm going to use 95% male mice and I'll put one female mouse in there. Hopefully the study section would say, no, that's not really addressing this. So I think it's something we won't fully know the impact of for some years still, but hopefully it's moving towards where we want it to go. Yes, yes, yes.
They would rather, something that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great too, because particularly for the larger facilities, that we support, it makes it easy. It would make it easier for us to assess their impact and their utilization, which we have ways of doing now. But as you know, it depends. Do they cite the grant? Do they cite the grant right? Things like that. So if they just put the number in and we were able to search that number, it'd make it a lot easier. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
That will stimulate the usage of here is RI. That means they need to, record themselves with marketplace. So
yeah, what? Yeah, I think so we have two places where this happens a lot, as you know. One is in the IDEA programs and COBRIs and IMBRIs. And then the other is we have a program that's supporting large national and regional resources. Both of those, this would be very useful for. So we're already asking them, how do you assess your use and utility? But as this comes online, this is something that we could you know, begin to at least point to as an example of what you could do. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so if, please do connect me because I think it sounds like a very useful thing.